Imagine drowning, but not in water. Imagine being trapped by something thick, sticky, and sweet. This wasn't a nightmare, it was a real disaster that struck Boston on January 15, 1919. On that cold winter day, the North End neighborhood was going about its usual business. Italian immigrants were cooking lunch in their homes, dock workers were loading ships, and children were playing in the streets. Nobody knew they were about to face one of the strangest disasters in American history. Standing over Commercial Street was a massive steel tank, 5 stories tall and 90 feet wide. It held 2.3 million gallons of molasses, not the kind you put on pancakes, but industrial molasses used to make alcohol and ammunition. The tank had become a normal part of the neighborhood over the past 4 years. People walked past it every day, barely noticing it anymore. But they did notice something strange. The tank was always leaking. The weather that morning was unusual. After weeks of bitter cold, the temperature had suddenly risen to above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The quick warming had strange effects on the molasses inside the tank. As the sun heated the metal walls, the thick liquid inside began to expand. The tank's steel walls groaned and creaked, sounds that had become familiar to locals. Children often brought buckets to collect the molasses that leaked from its seams, taking it home to their families. But today, the groaning was different, louder. Workers who passed by the tank noticed that the leak seemed worse than usual. The dark brown syrup was seeping through more cracks than before. A few people mentioned that the tank didn't look right, but nobody wanted to cause a fuss. After all, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which owned the tank, had ignored complaints before. The neighborhood was at its busiest as noon approached. Laborers were breaking for lunch, school children were walking home, and the streets were full of horses and carts making deliveries. The air was filled with the usual sounds of a working waterfront, ship horns, wagon wheels on cobblestones, and the various languages of the immigrant community. Above it all, the tank continued its ominous creaking, like a giant metal monster about to wake up. No one could have guessed that in just a few minutes, this ordinary winter day would turn into a scene from a horror story. The tank was about to unleash a disaster unlike anything Boston, or the world, had ever seen before. A wave of destruction was coming, not of water, not of fire, but of molasses. At 12:30 p.m., the disaster struck. People later said it started with a sound like a machine gun, followed by a deep rumble that shook the entire neighborhood. The tank's steel walls suddenly ripped apart, and what happened next seemed impossible. A wave of molasses, as tall as a house and moving faster than most people could run, exploded into the streets of Boston's North End. The wave wasn't slow like molasses usually is. The huge weight of all that liquid, combined with the pressure that had built up in the tank, created a flood that moved at 35 miles per hour. It was like a tidal wave, but thicker and deadlier. The brown wave crushed everything in its path. Buildings that had stood for decades crumbled like they were made of paper. Horses, wagons, and even cars were picked up and tossed around like toys. The sound was terrible, a mix of screaming, crushing wood, and the weird slurping noise of the molasses itself. People who were caught in the wave didn't stand a chance. The molasses was so thick that once it grabbed hold, it was almost impossible to escape. Some people were crushed by the force of the wave, while others found themselves trapped and struggling to breathe in the sticky flood. The damage spread quickly. The wave knocked houses off their foundations. It lifted a train right off its tracks. The molasses even pushed one building completely off its foundation, crushing the first floor until the second floor sat right on the ground. The nearby elevated train track was damaged so badly that one section began to collapse, threatening to drop a passing train into the flood below. What made it even worse was that the molasses wasn't just flowing on the ground, it was spraying through the air too. People blocks away from the tank found themselves getting hit by sticky brown drops falling from the sky. The air itself seemed to turn brown. Those who weren't hit by the main wave still had to deal with molasses raining down on them as they tried to run to safety. Within minutes, the neighborhood had turned into something out of a nightmare. Where there had been streets and buildings, there was now a sea of brown syrup, up to 6 feet deep in some places. And in that sea, people were desperately fighting for their lives, trying to stay above the surface of something that wanted to pull them under. The rescue efforts that followed were unlike anything emergency workers had ever faced. Firefighters and police officers, who rushed to the scene, found themselves wading through waist-deep molasses that felt like quicksand. Every step was a struggle. The harder they tried to move quickly, the more the molasses seemed to pull them down. Even worse, the rescuers couldn't tell if someone was trapped under the surface they were walking on. The chaos was made worse because nobody knew how to deal with this kind of disaster. Water could be pumped away, fires could be put out, but molasses, it stuck to everything and everyone. Rescuers tried using boards to walk on top of it, but the board sank. They tried hosing it away with water, but that just made the molasses thinner and spread it further. Some people who were pulled from the flood were so covered in the sticky syrup that rescuers couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. The harbor workers and sailors from nearby ships joined the rescue efforts. They brought ropes and makeshift walkways, trying to reach people who were trapped, but the molasses was already starting to harden in the cold air, making their job even harder. It was like trying to rescue people from slowly hardening cement. The more time passed, the more difficult the rescues became. The scenes were heartbreaking. A young child was found stuck in the molasses up to his chest, crying for help. It took 3 men nearly an hour to pull him free. A team of firefighters found a horse still alive but trapped in the sticky flood. They worked for hours trying to save it, but the animal was too badly stuck. These stories repeated all over the neighborhood as rescuers desperately searched for survivors. The hospitals weren't prepared for this kind of emergency either. People brought in from the flood were covered in molasses that wouldn't wash off with just water. Doctors and nurses had to use saws to cut through clothing that had hardened like candy. Some victims were barely recognizable under their brown coating. The hospitals quickly ran out of beds, and makeshift medical stations had to be set up in nearby buildings. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and the molasses began to harden even more. What had been a rushing flood was turning into a thick, sticky trap that held on to its victims like glue. Rescuers worked through the night with lanterns, listening for cries for help in the darkness. The whole neighborhood smelled sickly sweet, a smell that would linger for decades to come. Among all the chaos, individual stories of tragedy and survival began to emerge. Stephen Clougherty had been eating lunch with his family when their house was picked up and crushed by the wave. He managed to grab his sister and hold on to a ceiling beam, keeping them above the rising molasses while watching helplessly as their mother was swept away. It took rescuers 5 hours to reach them, and by then, the molasses had hardened around them like cement. The story of the O'Brien family was particularly heartbreaking. A 10-year-old boy named Michael had been collecting firewood near the tank when it burst. His father, who had been working nearby, spent hours searching for him in the sticky flood. He kept calling Michael's name until his voice gave out, but his son was already gone, buried somewhere under the molasses and debris. George Lay, a railroad worker, was having lunch in the freight house when the wave hit. The building collapsed around him, trapping him in a pocket of air. Rescuers could hear him calling for help, but by the time they reached the spot, the molasses had filled the space. They found his body 2 days later, still frozen in a position that showed he had been trying to break free. Not all the stories ended in tragedy. Elizabeth O'Brien had been walking home when she heard the tank burst. She started running but felt the molasses catching up to her. Just as it was about to reach her, a nearby police officer grabbed her arm and pulled her to safety. They both watched as the wave rushed past them, destroying everything in its path. The Smiths, a family of 4, had been having lunch in their second-floor apartment when the wave hit. Their building was lifted off its foundation, but instead of collapsing, it spun around and settled back down. They managed to climb out through a window and across makeshift bridges made of ladders to safety. When they looked back, their building was sitting in a sea of brown syrup. Maria DeStasio, who ran a small grocery store, had just stepped outside when she saw the wave coming. She tried to run back inside to warn her customers, but was caught by the flood. Somehow, she managed to grab onto a telephone pole and hold on as the molasses rushed past her. She stayed there for 2 hours until rescuers could reach her with a rope. As the rescue efforts finally ended, the question everyone asked was, how could this happen? The investigation that followed revealed a story of greed, negligence, and ignored warnings. The tank had been built in a hurry in 1915 by United States Industrial Alcohol Company. They needed to store molasses quickly to make alcohol for ammunition during World War I. The company had never even tested the tank with water before filling it with molasses. The investigation found serious problems with the tank's construction. The steel walls were too thin. The metal was poor quality. The rivet holes didn't line up properly. Even worse, Arthur Gell, the man who supervised the construction, couldn't even read a blueprint. He had just guessed at many of the important engineering details. When cracks appeared, instead of fixing them properly, workers were told to paint them brown so they wouldn't show. People from the neighborhood came forward to testify about the warnings they had given. Isaac Ehrlich, who worked nearby, had noticed the tank leaking and warned the company multiple times. Children who collected the leaking molasses in cups told investigators how the tank would make strange noises and leak more on warm days. Even the company's own inspector had reported problems, but his reports were ignored. The legal battle that followed lasted for 6 years. Over 100 lawyers were involved. They called in experts, who studied everything from engineering to meteorology. One expert figured out that the warm weather that day had caused the molasses to ferment, creating pressure inside the tank. When the tank broke, the pressure shot the molasses out like a cork from a champagne bottle. The court case changed history. For the first time, a company was held responsible for construction safety. United States Industrial Alcohol had to pay almost $1 million in damages, a huge amount in 1925. More importantly, the case led to new laws requiring engineers to sign off on their plans. Building inspectors got more power to check construction projects. These changes made buildings safer not just in Boston, but across America. The cleanup took months. Workers used salt water to wash away the molasses, and sand to absorb it. They found that the only thing that really cut through the sticky mess was salt water from the harbor. For weeks, all the rescue workers' clothes and boots had to be thrown away because they couldn't get the molasses out. Even the horses had to be shaved because their fur was hopelessly stuck together. Even today, more than 100 years later, the Great Molasses Flood leaves its mark on Boston. Old-timers in the North End used to say that on hot summer days, you could still smell molasses in the air. Some people say this is just a story, but for decades after the flood, residents would find traces of dried molasses in their basements and on their walls. The disaster changed how Americans thought about public safety. Before the flood, companies could build whatever they wanted, however they wanted. Nobody checked their work or held them responsible when things went wrong. After the flood, that all changed. Every new building project had to be checked by real engineers. Companies had to prove their buildings were safe before they could use them. The story affected Boston in other ways too. The North End neighborhood, which was mostly Italian immigrants at the time, became even more tight-knit after the disaster. Families who had lost everything helped each other rebuild. The community grew stronger through their shared tragedy. Even today, local residents point out places where the flood left its mark. A darker line on an old building, a bent piece of steel that was never removed. Scientists still study the disaster. They use modern computers to figure out exactly how the tank failed and why the molasses moved so fast. They discovered that when molasses flows quickly, it acts differently than water. It becomes thinner while moving, but thicker when it stops. This helped explain why so many people got trapped. The molasses became like cement as soon as it stopped flowing. Today, a small plaque marks the spot where the tank once stood. It's easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. The site is now a nice park, where children play baseball, and most of them have no idea about the tragedy that happened there. But every year on January the 15th, some people still come to remember the 21 people who lost their lives in Boston's strangest disaster. The Great Molasses Flood might sound funny at first, until you learn about the real human cost. It reminds us that even ordinary things can become deadly when people put profit ahead of safety. It shows how one company's carelessness can destroy many lives. Most importantly, it teaches us why we need rules and inspections to keep people safe. The most surprising thing about the Great Molasses Flood isn't what happened on that day in 1919, it's how it changed America forever. Before this disaster, construction companies and big industries didn't have to follow many safety rules. They could cut corners to save money, ignore problems, and didn't have to listen when people complained about dangers. After 21 people died in a flood of molasses, all of that changed. Today, every time an engineer signs off on building plans, every time a safety inspector checks a construction site, every time a company has to prove their building is safe, that's partly because of what happened in Boston's North End. The flood showed everyone what could go wrong when nobody was watching. It taught America that public safety was more important than saving money. The story reminds us that real change often comes from tragedy. Those 21 people who died didn't just become statistics. Their deaths led to new laws and safety rules that have saved countless lives since then. Every time a dangerous building project gets stopped before it can hurt anyone, it's because of lessons learned from disasters like the Molasses Flood. Even now, Boston keeps teaching us these lessons. When city planners talk about chemical storage tanks near neighborhoods, someone always brings up the Molasses Flood. When engineers design new buildings, they think about all the strange ways things could go wrong. When companies try to rush construction projects, inspectors remember what happened when United States Industrial Alcohol rushed to build their tank. The flood also teaches us something about stories, how the ones that seem unbelievable at first often turn out to be the most important. A flood of molasses sounds like a joke, but it changed how we build our cities. It sounds impossible, but it really happened. It sounds like something from a children's story, but it made our world safer. Maybe that's why the story of the Great Molasses Flood keeps being told. Not just because it's strange, but because it matters. It reminds us that safety rules are written in blood, that every inspection checklist exists because something once went terribly wrong. Most importantly, It shows us that even the strangest disaster can lead to positive change if we learn from it.